Welcome back, students. This is Module 2.1.2, Cell Types. Before we talk about types of cells, we're going to talk about some features which are common to all cells. So the first of three features that all cells have is the cell membrane. The cell membrane encloses a cell and separates it from the environment. It is a phospholipid bilayer with proteins embedded in it, and we'll talk more about the nature of the cell membrane later. It's membrane physiology, how membranes function, is an important thing for a cell biologist to understand. A second feature that all cells have is a nucleus or a nucleoid region. Although these have different names and they are slightly different, what they do have in common is DNA. DNA, of course, is the genetic material. It contains the hereditary information for a particular species. In bacterial cells or prokaryotic cells, this is simply an area, and so we call it the nucleoid, and there's not a membrane around it. In eukaryotic cells, such as animal and plant cells, this area is called a nucleus, and it has a membrane with DNA inside of it. And so these are important things to recognize, nucleus or nucleoid region. A third feature that all cells have is cytoplasm. And this is the background matrix, the fluid matrix that fills the interior of a cell. It contains various chemicals and structures depending on what type of cell it is. And it is an important medium for transportation as well as for chemical reactions to occur in and for maintaining homeostasis within the cell. And so just by way of review, if we look at all three of these features, the cell membrane, which we can see is present in a eukaryotic cell as well as a prokaryotic. Eukaryotic is an animal or plant or fungus or protist cell. A prokaryotic cell is only bacteria. A second feature is a nucleus or nucleoid region. Remember, this is really signified by DNA, the difference between a nucleus and a nucleoid being that the nucleus has a membrane around it, a nuclear membrane. No such membrane here, so this is a region. And the third feature that all cells have is cytoplasm, and this is the semi-fluid matrix which fills the cell. So critical to remember that. Yeah, I suppose you can see some of those features here, certainly the membrane, and this is a close-up showing the membrane, phospholipids with various other components, these purple blobs are proteins. And then we can see the nucleus in this case, so it has a nuclear membrane and DNA inside, and then we can see the cytoplasm with all the juice and things that are found within it. So I've already given you this information to some extent, but there are two major types of cells: prokaryotic cells and eukaryotic cells. And what the dichotomy or the difference between these two is basically based on the presence or absence of a nucleus and other organelles. And as you can see from this table, this is a format of table that I like very much. It shows the two things that we're comparing, and down the middle it shows a feature of comparison at that moment. So the first feature we can compare between prokaryotic and eukaryotic cells is a membrane-bound nucleus. And we can see that in prokaryotic cells that the nucleus is absent. And so it is absent, and so it has the nucleoid region with its DNA. That's as opposed to the eukaryotic cell where the nucleus is present. It is there's a double membrane with nuclear pores, a nuclear membrane, and inside that there is DNA. The second feature we can compare between prokaryotic and eukaryotic cells is a typical cell size. And although these units don't mean anything, what does matter is the relative size. Prokaryotic cells are a magnitude smaller. They may be 1 to 10 micrometers in diameter, while a eukaryotic cell is about 10 times larger, 10 to 100 micrometers in diameter. So it just gives you the idea that eukaryotic cells are much larger than prokaryotic cells. The next feature we can compare here are organelles. Now, I am going to define organelles for you, but these are the little structures inside certain types of cells. So these are the membrane-bound structures inside. And we can see that prokaryotic cells lack organelles, while eukaryotic cells have organelles. In fact, the nucleus is an organelle. And so that helps you to understand that that's present in the eukaryotic cells. The form of the DNA in prokaryotic cells, it's circular. So prokaryotic cells have a single chromosome, and we sometimes say they have naked circular DNA. Circular meaning it's just a one big connected circle. We say it's naked because it's not complex with proteins. That's as opposed to in eukaryotic cells, the DNA is packaged in linear units, and we call these chromosomes. So there are many chromosomes in eukaryotes, and in a prokaryote only has one chromosome, and it's circular. And of course, if it has more genes or has more DNA, then it's a bigger circle, and if it has less DNA, it's a smaller circle. Now, the examples of a prokaryotic cell, all prokaryotes are bacteria. Eukaryotes, by contrast, are plants, animals, fungi, and protists. A protist is a thing like an amoeba or a paramecium, one-celled creatures, but there's some protists that are multicellular. For example, they group some of the algae in there. Some of the big seaweeds are found there. But for the most part, you can think of the protists as being eukaryotic and unicellular. Cellular organization. The prokaryotes are unicellular, which means they have one cell, and they may be colonial, which means an aggregation of the one-celled organisms, as opposed to eukaryotic organisms tend to be multicellular. Some are unicellular, as I was speaking of some of the protists. The cell wall in prokaryotic cells, it's present in most bacteria, and it contains a molecule that we didn't talk about when we talked about polysaccharides, but we could have. And this molecule is called peptidoglycan. And peptidoglycan is very typical of some prokaryotic cell walls. Now, if we look at eukaryotic cells, and the cell wall, by the way, is a rigid structure that's found outside the cell membrane, and it's used for support. And not all cells have cell walls. Most bacteria, most prokaryotic cells do. But with eukaryotic cells, it varies. Plants have cell walls made out of cellulose. That cellulose is a major component in wood. Fungi have cell walls made out of chitin. One of the polysaccharides that we learned about earlier. It has a nitrogen group and some cross bonding, making it quite strong. Animal cells do not have cell walls, so it gives us an indication of who does and doesn't have cell walls. So this is just some basic facts that will help us to compare prokaryotic and eukaryotic cells. Before we go on, although I'm going to touch on this again in a slide or two, I want to talk about the etymology of these two names. Prokaryotic. Karyo is taken to mean the nucleus, and pro means before the nucleus. So these cells, prokaryotic cells, lack a nucleus, as opposed to eukaryotic cells. Karyo still is taken to mean nucleus, and EU means good or true. So eukaryotic cells have a good or true nucleus, and indeed that's an important identifying feature. And here's a definition of organelles. These are subcellular membrane-bound structures that carry out specific functions. What does that mean? It means there are small little things with membranes inside cells that have specific functions. And eukaryotic cells have organelles, prokaryotic cells do not. Here's an idea. This is showing some bacteria. This is the tip of a pin, and you can see that as we zoom in, that those are the bacteria, the little orange rod-shaped, or they would be bacilli because they are rod-shaped. So just before we end this module, we want to talk a little bit more about eukaryotic cells. I already gave you the etymology of eukaryotic. Eu means good or true. Karyon means neither kernel. It's taken to mean nucleus, so good or true nucleus. And eukaryotic cells are more complex than prokaryotic cells because they have what we call compartmentalization, because they have membrane-bound organelles. And do also recall that eukaryotic cells are typically larger. In this class, we're going to introduce two major types of eukaryotic cells. There are at least 4 groups that have eukaryotic cells, but we're only going to talk about specifically about this cell types of 2 of them. We're going to talk about plant cells and animal cells, and we'll compare them to one another. And there's the other groups, fungi and protists, and we're not going to specifically study their types of cells. There is a relationship between these 4 groups. There are 4 groups of eukaryotes, and there were 3 different lineages of protists that gave rise to plants, animals, and fungi. So the Protista had ancestral groups to these three different lineages that were successful. There were many other Protistan lineages which didn't go anywhere. There's scores of these other lineages. Okay, let's compare plant and animal cells. Here's another one of my tables in which we have the feature we're going to compare, 2 by comparison, and the feature we're comparing down the middle. So plant cells on the left, animal cells on the right. The first feature we'll compare is something called a central vacuole. A central vacuole is what it sounds like. It's a vacuous area in the center. It's a membrane-bound structure. It's an organelle which plants have and use to store fluids and crystals, and animal cells lack. A second feature is chloroplasts. Chloroplasts are also organelles. They're membrane-bound structures that contain the green pigment chlorophyll, and plants use them for photosynthesis. So plants have them, animals lack them. A third feature is cell walls. I've already told you this. Plants have cell walls, and you might write right under here, not only are they present, but they're made of cellulose. And animal cells lack cell walls. Centrioles are structures we'll learn more about when we're talking about cell division, but they help to organize the protein fibers that move chromosomes around during cell division. And plant cells lack centrioles, and animal cells have them. They're kind of barrel-like structures, and when they're together, they're in a larger structure that we name, but I'm not going to make you learn its name here. The number of cell types, plants have, the most complex plants have 20 to 30 types of cells. The most complex animals have 200 types of cells, and that's excluding neurons in the brain, of which humans have close to 200. So you can see that there are many more types of cells in animals than in plants. And the shape of the cells, because plant cells have rigid cell walls of cellulose, their shape is typically regular or geometrical, while animal cells have soft, squishy membranes, and their shape is typically irregular. And before we sign off, we just want to show you, these pictures are generalized pictures. This is a generalized animal cell. It's made from observations of cells using many techniques. It would be very difficult to see all of this in a single cell like this. So this is a composite from many different techniques. But notice that it doesn't have a central vacuole, doesn't have a rigid cell wall, doesn't have chloroplasts. The centrioles are right here. Here are those barrel-like structures that will help organize those protein fibers during cell division. So that's a generalized animal cell. A generalized plant cell, the central vacuole has a large area. We don't really see these lines if we look through a light microscope. We'll just see this central area that doesn't have much. And in plant cells, we can see these chloroplasts quite easily, these green discs with the green pigment chlorophyll. And of course has a rigid cell wall outside the cell membrane here. So this gives us an introduction to some of the major types of cells, eukaryotic cells and prokaryotic cells. And then among eukaryotes, we looked at plant and animal cells. And that will end this module.